Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Curot Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1979 comedy drama titled More American Graffiti. Now, More American Graffiti is a comedy drama that runs for 1 hour and 50 minutes long. It is written and directed by Bill Norton. It is produced by Howard Kazanjian and George Lucas, who directed the previous American Graffiti film back in 1973. The characters were created by George Lucas, Gloria Katz, and Willard Hayek. The cinematography was done by Caleb Deschanel, and the editing was done by Tina Hirsch. And the stars of the movie are Paul Lamatt, Cindy Williams, Candy Clark, Ron Howard, Charles Martin Smith, Anna Bjarn, Mackenzie Phillips, and the return of Harrison Ford. Also, some familiar names also appear in this movie, including Scott Glenn, Mary Kay Place, Wolfman Jack, Naomi Judd, Rosanna Arquette, and Delroy Lindo. So, with the exception of Kurt, played by Richard Dreyfuss, missing in this unneeded sequel to the classic Academy Award winning film American Graffiti, More American Graffiti has the rest of the gang back. Not where we left them off, but 3 years later from the previous film. If I'm not mistaken, Kurt went off to become a draft dodger in Canada, if memory serves me correctly from the last film. And while, yes, it is fun to find out what's happened with them after the credits rolled 3 years later, the spark and the intensity, however, did not come back. The sole purpose for the sequel, like any other sequels before and after this one, was that it was there just to follow in on the big budget success of its predecessors and take advantage of a good thing coming. And while I was entertained by the sequel, I couldn't find a legitimate reason why they needed this sequel to begin with. However, what's different from the other sequels is that More American Graffiti actually does make the effort by trying not to follow the same pattern as what was offered before, but a new and fresh look at the gang and what they're doing now. But what really drowns this movie badly is that, like from a lot of stories where they all live happily ever after, and while they all seem to be, bright and chipper individuals, it seems in growing up in the 50s, well, now that the 60s has come around, it seems like their spontaneous happiness has gone completely absent from this movie, as they all seem to be not living, a happily ever after. And that, of course, a happily ever after, like in a lot of stories, is just a misnomer. There is no happily ever after, and I think that's what More American Graffiti was trying to point out. That happily ever after is just a bunch of hyperbole. I mean, of course, every day we'll have good days and bad days and off days and fine days, but, it seems like the gang from American Graffiti seem to be living their own lives, and in general it's not particularly for the better. Alright, the movie was generally just a potpourri of events that happened during the 1960s, between 1964 to 1967. And I guess this is actually not bad if you like to sort of take a good look at 60s culture and what people were facing back in the 60s. But the stuff that's depicted in this movie could have just been something you could have learned in history class. And you know, it's just things that you see in the news, things that you've heard of. I mean, it has kind of like a bit of a documentary feel of 60s life mixed in with some movie scenarios. I mean, some of the subplots are pretty good, as you know, we look at 4 separate stories that seems to emanate, you know, 4 straight New Year's Eves between 1964 to 67, and there's a whole bunch of subplots. But unlike American Graffiti, sure, I know there was a whole bunch of series of subplots involving different characters facing different scenarios, kind of almost like a soap opera setting. Yes, American Graffiti did have that, but then in the end they all united near the end of the movie. In More American Graffiti, the whole gang is only like seen in one scene, and then they never see each other again, as they all just continue to live their separate lives. There is no reunion. And what I think about this movie is that it just sort of just follows along from the epilogue from the previous American Graffiti. I mean, everything that was fed to us in the epilogue of American Graffiti is brought to life here in More American Graffiti. So the suspense has been completely expunged in this movie. But away we go. Here were the 4 sub-stories. Starting with New Year's Eve 1964. This is the John Milner story. John Milner, from what we last left off from the previous American Graffiti, you know, has lived his life on the edge doing drag racing. Well, now he continues to drag racing, and now reels in the big bucks in doing drag racing. And he, of course, falls smitten for a foreign exchange student named Eva, played by Anna Bjorn, who doesn't speak a word of English. So, you know, he's trying to struggle, you know, trying to interact with her without the use of vocalization or language, since, you know, it doesn't seem to quite get to her because she doesn't speak a word of English. And you know, he wants to really get himself committed into this relationship. And I think that's like the most interesting subplot in More American Graffiti, as I've kind of grown to liking John Milner from the first one. Then we go to 1965. This one too was also a pretty interesting subplot, as we have Terry the Toad, played by Charles Martin Smith. He has gone off to Vietnam, but is now finding his ways to get discharged home. He is a helicopter surveyor, and you know, at first he seemed somewhat enthusiastic about going off to Vietnam, but now he just wants to get discharged and will do anything he can, even if it means to blow his arm off. Anything to get a discharge. I believe one of his friends there, his name was Little Joe Young of the Pharaohs, played by Bo Hopkins. He gets killed off, and now Terry the Toad just wants out and will do anything he can to get his discharge. Then we go to 1966. Debbie Dunham, played by Candy Clark, who, when we last left off, she was actually in a relationship with Terry the Toad, but unsure as to whether he's going to come home, and because he hasn't really sent her any letters or stuff like that, she doesn't know whether he's actually survived or has died. So she has decided to move on to a hippie lifestyle, which seems a bit like a cliche, being that it is a 60s driven movie. And she's hanging out with groupies, and she seems to also be in a precarious relationship with her boyfriend, who is a total loser, and she just doesn't seem to be living a happy lifestyle with him. And then we go to 1967 as Prom Night. Queen and King, Laurie and Steve Bolander, played by Cindy Williams and Ron Howard, both of Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley fame. They're now married and they have twin boys, Michael and Mark. They're both college students. Laurie, of course, has her sights driven on a career move, whereas Steve still has that archaic, misogynistic belief that a woman's place is to watch the kids while the man is supposed to be the breadwinner. But, and of course, you know, during that period of time, too, there was the student protests at, I think it was Berkeley, I don't remember, maybe it was Kent State. Anyhow, they got caught in the unfortunate ruckus that erupted there, and they're just trying to survive life and limb from the doldrums of what they're facing there too. So, you know, they have not particularly lived a glorious life from when we've last left them. Sure, there's a bit of pros and cons, as each subplot seems to shift back and forth, and there's different screening formats, which also kind of like adds to the confusion. And we don't really fully get the gist of each of their mediocre individual stories, and it comes to the point where we just don't really care about the characters. In American Graffiti we cared about them, here we couldn't really care less. And the only one to me that got me enthralled was the Milner side story and his jilted romance with an Icelandic beauty named Eva, who speaks no English, but their chemistry comes alive through motions that really far exceeds words. It kind of like brings back the reason why American Graffiti was truly a work of art. It was simple, pure, innocent coming-of-age drama that was both provocative and enlightening at the very same time. These stories here are just a nostalgic time machine travel through the 60s, when topics back then were the central focuses that were just headlining the news at the time, like the Vietnam War, the hippie movements, where young idealists decided to drift out of the context to come up with innovative ways to carry on in life. The thing that separates the sequel here is that in American Graffiti, the creative control is not entirely handled by George Lucas, and he has decided to just took a back seat and served as the executive producer. That's really what his job was here. The heavy cargo carrying this film is Mr. Bill L. Norton, who served as both the writer and the director of the movie. And while Norton does do an incredible effort in putting interesting, refreshing elements into the sequel, and even though I expected more than I got, I still found this ambitious story a difficult task at hand, coming from a television director. And each of the 4 stories have kind of remarkable takes in their delivery, though the hippie subplot was much too technical and really didn't hold too much interest. I think that one was the most laborious subplot of them all. I mean, I don't know where it was going with that one, the hippie subplot. It looked mostly just like a documentary of what the hippie movement was like in the 60s. Okay, so overall I really can't recommend more American Graffiti because for the fact that it's not up there with the genius that is American Graffiti. And if you love American Graffiti, you will truly detest more American Graffiti all the more. But if you must watch it, you know, do so, you know, just for curiosity's sake, and you'll see it's nothing like the first story, and it truly lacks the intensity that the predecessor possessed. If you come in with a low expectation, right, it truly might hold your interests. And if you found the story dull, well, there are some notable pre-fame stars that you might come across, like Scott Glenn, who plays a hippie guy named Newt, who eventually befriends Debbie. Mary Kay Place is also in there, Delroy Lindo, and yes, indeed, Harrison Ford also returns to the scene as the hippie-hating cop officer Bob Falfa. So if I was to give More American Graffiti a rating out of 10, I would have to give it a 6. You know, it was just not necessarily needed to have a sequel. It was just another cash cow from the previous movie. They thought that, hey, you know, this American Graffiti was successful, so let's just bring a sequel and try to sort of follow up of what happened during the epilogue, and just bring the epilogue from American Graffiti to life, and to see how their fate came about just after the epilogue of American Graffiti. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you like to subscribe, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, you may feel free to do so. Remember, be kind, be courteous, and I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Carruth Writer saying take care of yourselves, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.